The views and opinions expressed in this video are those of the speakers and panelists, and do not necessarily reflect the position of the ETHOS Institute for Public Christianity and its founding institutions and organizations.
So there's a theological debate between him and figures in the church. How do we think of two scientific paradigms, a more Aristotelian paradigm from the past, or a new paradigm that was emerging of a heliocentric solar system as opposed to a geocentric universe? These were things at issue. And aside from the sort of intellectual issues involved, you had the institutional, political, and personal issues, which were very real and significant. The whole debate was inflamed by professional jealousies, academic politics, and personality conflicts. And I'll give you one example of Galileo's personality that caused him some trouble. Maybe an analogy, in America we have a radio talk show host named Rush Limbaugh. If you agree with him, you love him. If you don't agree with him, he ruffles your feathers. And I think Galileo could be seen as an example of that. He actually was a personal acquaintance of the Pope. He knew him from the time before he was a Pope, and the Pope was interested in his theories, and he had a private conversation with him. They had dialogue asking about them. And then later, Galileo wrote a book, and the way they argued things back then was to put them in the form of a dialogue. So they'd have fictitious characters representing different points of view. And Galileo took the Pope's questions and he put them in the mouth of a character named Simplicio. He needed an advisor to say, this is not a good idea. Because he needlessly offended someone that was in a very influential position to allow his theories to have a sympathetic hearing. Okay, so I'm not saying Galileo is a bad guy, but what I'm saying is this picture that has been given of black hats, white hats is false. And similar distortions as well with the Scopes trial in the U.S., the Wilberforce-Huxley debate, all of these things. And the historians of science, some of them that I've mentioned, have debunked all of these and shown how they have been misrepresented. Because they've been they don't care about the past, they care about the present use of a story they can tell about the past for an ongoing cultural and philosophical conflict. Okay, so the conflict thesis is bogus, and I can find you atheists who will tell you the same thing, informed about the relevant history. Okay, all right. So now we go to the opposite extreme. We can think about compartmentalization. If conflict is wrong, maybe we should think in terms of science and theology are in two different neighborhoods, They can never even come into contact, so therefore they can't possibly conflict. Now, you should sort of get the idea that if it's a total opposite extreme of conflict, it's probably also extreme, just the other extreme, and probably not right, okay? And if that's your instinct, you would be correct. Okay. On this view, I illustrated by Grissom saying he died from the bullet through the heart. Horatio, his number was up. It's fated or whatever, the will of God. It was just his time to go. Right? These explanations don't even come into contact with one another. And that's a compartmentalization view. And on this view, science and theology are concerned with two distinct and separate realms. The science deals with the natural realm. Theology, the supernatural realm, or something like that. So they can't even possibly conflict with one another. And now, probably the best example of this view is Stephen Jay Gould, evolutionist, paleontologist of Harvard University who died some years ago. He wrote a book called Rocks of Ages on Science and Religions, where he spells out his ideas on this. Now, there is some truth to this view. There are a lot of things that science talks about that theology is just not interested in. How does the pressure, temperature, and volume of a certain quantity of hydrogen gas relate to one another? I'm a theologian. I don't care about that. Whatever the scientists say, sure, whatever, it's fine. I don't care. Okay, let me talk about the security of the believer, Calvinism, Arminianism, or new perspective on Paul. I'm put all the scientists to sleep. They don't care about that, right? So yeah, there's a certain amount of truth. There are certain areas where they don't overlap, okay? But it's not a total separation. There are areas of overlap. I mean, there's enough truth there is a grain of truth, a partial truth in the conflict thesis, right? And if there is a grain of truth there, then compartmentalization can't be the whole truth either. And so this is a way of maybe ducking conflict when in fact there is a potential for real conflict in certain areas. Sometimes theology and science speak on the same issues. The origin of man, for example, or the origin of the universe. And to pretend that they don't is just, well, happy talk. Okay, now typically this view of compartmentalization is used by more sophisticated opponents of Christianity. So for example, Stephen Jay Gould, who is an atheist, the way he explained this way of thinking is to think of science and religion as something called non-overlapping magisteria. Now I think you've got that written out on your handouts. I don't need to spell it or anything. But magisteria is a plural of a singular magisterium. And we can define a magisterium as something like a teaching authority. So sometimes you might hear the phrase the magisterium of the Catholic Church or of the Pope or something like that. Okay, more typically in a context like that, you might hear that phrase. And it would refer to the teaching authority, okay, of the Catholic Church. So on this view, science has a teaching authority, if you will, tells us what we should believe about the natural world. And theology has a teaching authority over the supernatural world or the divine, or what we should believe about God or about the meaning, overall meaning of human existence. Right? And so this sometimes is abbreviated as NOMA, N-O-M-A. And so Gould proposes that we should think in terms of NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria. And the idea here is that good neighbors respect one another's boundaries. Right? Can't we all just get along? That's kind of the idea, right? Now, but there's a problem with that, and we need to raise a few questions. It sounds good at first, but where are the boundaries? Who gets to decide where the boundary lies between science and theology? And what about in a culture that is influenced by the way of thinking that we looked at called scientism? Well, practically speaking, in such a culture, science gets to decide where the boundaries lie. You know, Hitler could have got along with anybody if everyone had just agreed to let him set the boundaries. You know, Austria in 1936, Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia in 1938, Poland 1939. Oh, too far. I told you I'm a history guy. Okay, right. So this is a bit of a problem. You know, practically speaking, science gets to decide the boundaries, define the boundaries, and science gets to discuss all of the important questions of knowledge and truth that are relevant for the public square. What about us? Well, we huddle in private meetings like this. Only people who register can come, but not fit for the public square. We get together in our holy huddles in our churches on the weekends. We do this as our hobby on our weekend, and we're just content with the meaning of it all. But it's not publicly legitimate truth to speak in the public square. Make no mistake about it. Stephen Jay Gould, what he's proposing sounds so nice, but it's a nice way of saying, you, Christians, surrender any claim to knowledge in the public square. And if you're going to be faithful to Christ, you will equally politely say, no, thank you. Absolutely not. This is not acceptable for a faithful follower of Jesus Christ. Now, these two views, I think, that we've just discussed are held more at the popular level, where a lot of the debate among Christian thinkers is between the next two views. Okay, so we're going to spend a little bit more time on them, between this view called complementarianism and the interaction view. Okay? So When we talk about complementarianism, we're talking about a view that you don't really find among atheists, because they're saying theology and science are complementary, and atheists don't care to have things be complementary. They want to dismiss theology altogether, right? So this is what I'm going to talk about now with complementarianism. We're going to be addressing a view that's very prevalent among Christian academics, philosophers, scientists, thinkers at a very high level, at an academic level, okay? And it is influential. So we'll be talking about, in some cases, brothers in the faith. I hope I can do so respectfully, and obviously I've already sort of telegraphed to you guys that this is not the view that I advocate. But we need to spend a little bit of time describing it. So complementarity, on this view, science and theology are complementary, complete, and non-interacting perspectives on the same reality. The non-interacting adjective is very important. You might say this is a more sophisticated version of the compartmentalization view, which is also a non-interacting perspective. But this one is a little bit more complex. It's a little bit more sophisticated, okay? But it's a more sophisticated version of that thing, okay? In some ways, the conflict view and the interaction view have something in common. Interaction is a bit more sophisticated version of conflict that just denies that conflict is intrinsic, but they certainly are interacting at the same level. That's where they agree, okay? But the interaction model is a bit more nuanced, okay? And there are more kinds of relationship that can happen other than conflict. Compartmentalization and complementarity are also kind of related. Again, complementarity is a bit more nuanced, a bit more sophisticated. But what they agree on is that essentially there's a non-interaction between science and theology. Okay? So I illustrated this by Grissom saying he died because the bullet pierced his heart, and Horatio said he died because someone killed him. Okay? And think of it this way. If this was like a court case where they found the suspect and he went to a trial, then what Horatio said would be important. That would be part of what would be talked about in the court case in terms of how the person died, and the kind of things that Horatio talked about would also be important in terms of means, motive, intention, opportunity, and things like that. And if you've ever watched TV with a murder trial or sat in on one, you know that both of these kind of things are discussed. Okay, so so to get the whole picture of this murder and how this guy wound up dead, we need both of their testimony. We need to put them together, okay? And I think that might help us in thinking about this complementarity model. Now, why do I pick a ladder? Well, what you need to understand about this view is that it pictures reality as in a very stratified or layered sense. And when I Googled image, I don't know how in the world, what picture illustrates this, but I thought this ladder kind of does the job. If you can find a better picture and send it to me, that's great. So for example, we think about reality, and at the lowest level or the lowest rung of the ladder, we think about the things that physics studies, okay? The elementary and fundamental particles and forces, okay? At one time they thought it was the atom, then they thought, well, protons and quarks, and they've come up with all kinds of esoteric particles that might be more fundamental or more elementary or more subatomic and so forth, right? And quantum level and all of that, okay? But at the most fundamental layer, we could give a complete description of reality at that level, of the interaction of the fundamental particles and forces. If we take that and go up a huge level of complexity, we would get to the level of reality that's studied by chemistry. And we might think in terms of things like hydrogen and carbon and other elements of the periodic table, and how they can combine to form molecules of compounds and things like this, H2O, all of that, right? Okay. And so that would maybe be the second rung on the ladder. And really chemistry is just hyper-complex physics, okay? But let's keep going up the ladder, okay? And if you think about chemistry, and some of the most complex form of chemistry is found in living beings. So you go up a level of complexity, you get to the level of reality that's studied by biology. But really, living bodies are just hyper-complex chemistry, right? But if we keep going up the ladder, then we think about what living bodies do, and that is they behave. Living bodies behave in certain ways. They act, they do things, they make choices, and apparently they do so, and it's related to all sorts of things that go on in the mind or the brain. They have plans, they have intentions, they think about things, they make a decision, and then that affects the behavior and movement of their body. And so we study that through psychology, right? And, if you have a certain vision of the world, you might just say, psychology is just really hyper-complex biology. And they might even, some people would say, all of that's really biologically driven. Then if we go horizontal with our psychology, we think not just of one individual, but of many across the board. We have the realm of reality studied by sociology, right? And if you're a good Christian, which all complementarians are, Christian, you add the layer of theology on top. Okay, so it's a very stratified, but at each level of reality, it's complete. And there's no interaction between the levels. And so on this view, science and theology involve different levels of description. And science basically tells us what happened and how. And theology will investigate whether God had anything to do with it. So it might investigate the who kind of a question or the why kind of a question. Now, in terms of some of the so-called usual suspects, here are some complementarians that are noteworthy. So on the left, there's Nancy Murphy, philosopher at Fuller University Seminary. I forget actually what the name of the school, in Pasadena. Howard J. Van Til, formerly of Calvin College. And there's some books that they've written. And Richard Bube. And this viewpoint is promoted by the American Scientific Affiliation, and they have a journal called Perspectives on Science and Faith. And so you'll see that reflected there. And so what people like Murphy or Van Til would say is that, theology is legitimate, but it's just describing a particular level of reality, and it doesn't interact with the level of reality described by the sciences. So each of these different perspectives or studies of reality are partial, but at their particular level they are complete. And they do not have gaps that need to be filled in at another level. Okay? So let's illustrate this with an electrical sign. Okay? Let's say you have an electrical sign at a Kopitiam somewhere, a hawker center, and let's say the sign is neon, okay, and it says black pepper lamian. Okay. Now you could give a complete scientific description of how the sign works electrically. You send a charge through the neon gas and it lights up a certain color and so forth. You can give a complete scientific description of the sign at that level. That will not explain the meaning of the words on the sign or why they were put there. You could give a personal explanation of the words on the sign that will not say anything about neon or electrons or anything like that. The scientific description will talk that kind of language. The description about the meaning will talk in terms of intention. Like the guy says, well, I sell black pepper lamian. I want people to know about it. And this is an area... a lot of angmos around here, so I better put it in English, right? And these explanations will not intersect with one another, okay? Each is complete at their own level, so it's not like there's a gap at the electrical level and something about the guy's intention has to come down to explain how that sign works. And they talk about God kind of in the same way, that if we can't explain something at any of these natural levels, they feel that we should never assume that there is a gap in scientific explanation, that we have to make God a causal actor who does something in the natural world to explain it. They would say, look, this is science and theology can get along as long as there's no illicit territorial encroachment. So, and this it kind of sounds a little bit like compartmentalization, doesn't it? Like I said, it's a more sophisticated version of that. And by the way, They say this in general. Not only, they don't like this whole top-down coming into lower levels to explain. And you know, it's very interesting. What happens is not only do these people typically, by default, they wind up in a kind of a theistic evolutionary position, but it's not just God. It's even top-down causality from, like, let's say, the soul doing things in my body. They really love bottom-up causation and try to reduce everything to bottom-up causation. So the same process, it tends to eliminate God from being much of a causal actor in scientific history. In terms of our day-to-day life, they tend towards some kind of determinism, or maybe they'll call it compatibilism. But in terms of the mind causing things bodily, they have a problem. They don't like this top-down causation stuff. So it's these same type of people also are on the other, I won't say the wrong, the other side of the debate about whether we have a soul that actually does things, okay? Well, but that's a talk for another time. Okay, but the implication of this way of thinking then is methodological naturalism. When we do science, we have to assume methodological naturalism. Well, what does that mean? Naturalism we can just take as a synonym for atheism. But this is not philosophical naturalism or metaphysical naturalism that affirms atheism. It's atheism assumed for the sake of doing something. It's atheism assumed for the role of doing science, let's say. Okay, that God cannot play any role at all in science. And so things in the natural world, natural phenomena, must always have a natural causal explanation, never a supernatural one. And for example, Howard Van Til, actually Paul de Vries, I should quote him first. Paul de Vries is a complementarian. He says the natural sciences are committed to the systematic analysis of matter and energy within the context of methodological naturalism. Howard Van Til has said, God has created the world with functional integrity. By this term, I mean to denote a created world that has no functional deficiencies. He means like no gaps, right? Yeah, no gaps in its economy of any sort that would require God to act immediately, temporarily assuming the role of creature to perform functions within the economy of the created world that other creatures have not been equipped to perform. Now, do you believe as a Christian that we should believe that God, in principle, never assumes the role of creature to do things in the world? Does your Christianity give you any reason for believing that that's true? I like you shaking your head no. I wish everyone was shaking their head no vigorously. You know, on this view, God never shows up. But at the heart of our view of reality is that God shows up. From time to time, He shows up. He's not always behind the scenes. Yes, He's the author of the story. Yes, He's the director of the play. But at the heart of our faith is that sometimes He steps on the stage in ways that are visible, detectable. All right? And if you believe this, I don't know, if you believe what Howard Van Til says, I don't know why you would even be a Christian. Well, I've always found a deep inconsistency in Howard Van Til. After he retired from Calvin College, he announced he's no longer a Christian. So at least he's more consistent. Now, I'm not saying all he's of a very extreme sort of complementarian. And my criticism that I've just made, I'm only applying it to him, not every complementarian out there, okay? All right. Complementarians say that, hey, this interaction view or talking about intelligent design is a God of the gap strategy. You're saying there's a gap there. We don't know how something happened. We say God did it, and then later we find the scientific explanation, and so we squeeze God out. So they criticize the fourth view that we will look at. Okay, so there is some truth in this. You know, we should look for natural causes for things, of course, and shouldn't be hasty in giving that up, but I would say that the real problem with complementarianism is it's bad philosophy. It pre-commits us to methodological naturalism, and if you take that view of things, then by default, before you ever look at the evidence, whether biblical or scientific, theistic evolution is the only choice you have. And I think that's a big commitment to make before we look at the evidence on a sort of case-by-case basis. Okay, we're running low on time, so let's move on to discuss the interaction view. On this view, science and theology are interacting approaches on the same reality, and therefore they occasionally ignore one another, like compartmentalization says. They sometimes dialogue with one another. They might support one another, or they might conflict with one another. They might disagree. Okay, so there are a lot of ways the relationship could turn out as they deal with a particular topic. Okay, and on this view, what's important is that they can interact, and they can interact at the same level of reality. There is interaction. They can talk about the same thing. Okay. In terms of some people and representative institutions, I would say the Discovery Institute is kind of the biggest institution, aside from seminaries or what have you, that push this paradigm. People like J.P. Moreland, William Dembski, Stephen Meyer, who are pictured there with some of their works. Okay, now, it seems to me that this is the right philosophical starting point. It just seems kind of obvious and open to the possibilities. And if we're going to let the Bible speak for itself, of course, using responsible hermeneutics to decide what exactly the Bible is affirming, it's the right way to treat Scripture, and to be open to the evidence, both scriptural and scientific, and see what might result, rather than pre-committing ourselves ahead of time because of a philosophical decision such as complementarianism makes. Now, there are two areas of debate, two key questions between these two approaches. And the first is, does science, in fact, require methodological naturalism? Can God ever play an explanatory role in our scientific theories or our scientific endeavors? Well, I would suggest to you that science and theology interrelate anyway. I mean, science is a couple of things. It's a problem-solving discipline. I talked about iPhones and technology. Yes, it helps us solve practical problems, but it also helps us solve conceptual problems, how we think about our universe, how we think about our world. And conceptual problems can come in two varieties. There can be internal conceptual problems where there's an internal contradiction or something in the theory is vague, not well defined. But there are also external conceptual problems. And that would be where a justified or rationally held belief or theory from another discipline comes into conflict with a scientific theory. For a long time, let me give you an example. There was a Muslim thinker from the Middle Ages named Ghazali who came up with an argument that showed that the universe had a beginning. Some Christian theologians accepted it as well. And of course, in Christianity, theologically, if we believe in creation ex nihilo, we would think, oh, the universe probably has a beginning. Now, I think Ghazali made an excellent philosophical argument that the universe had a beginning. But in the years since Ghazali lived, cosmologies came into fashion that said the universe is eternal. It has no beginning. And that was sort of the popular theory. Now, I would suggest to you that if Ghazali's philosophical argument is sound, he presents an external conceptual problem for infinite universe or eternal universe cosmologies, even though Ghazali was not a scientist. And so, in wrestling with these things, wrestling with beliefs that seem to be rational and well evidenced from other disciplines, theology, philosophy, history even can enter into the very heart of doing science. So that in itself seems to me to speak against methodological naturalism. One other distinction I think we can make, though, to help us with this issue, does science require methodological naturalism, is to think about the kinds of sciences that are out there. And the first is what we might call operation science, or empirical science, or laboratory science. And when we do this kind of science, we just want to know how the stuff in the world works. Probably the paradigm example is chemistry. If you are a chemist, you want to know how, let's say, carbon what its properties are, and how it interacts with different circumstances or other substances. What happens if you take a given quantity of carbon, you heat it up to such and such temperature, subject it to such and such pressure over a certain amount of time? What happens? How does this stuff work? What does it do? And if you're studying carbon, you want to know what that stuff is and how it works, you don't want anybody interfering with it. You don't want God to tamper with it. You don't want Klingons or Vulcans to tamper with it if they exist. You can be totally agnostic about whether they exist or not, or angels or demons, but you don't want them to tamper with it, because the whole point is to figure out what carbon does and how it works. If you watch a Big Bang Theory, that show, there are these nerdy scientists, and sometimes they play pranks on one another, and they interfere with their little experiments they're running and sabo one another. You don't want that either. So the idea is, in operation science, you don't want any intelligent agent to intervene and interfere. Methodological naturalism is very appropriate to that endeavor because of the focus and intent of what that endeavor is all about, what that discipline is all about. But that's not the only kind of science out there. There's a whole other family of sciences that we might call historical sciences, where you're trying to look at what happened in a specific past event. CSI would be a great example. There's a dead body there. How did it happen? Was it an accident? Or was there an intelligent actor involved? Now, I got to tell you, if you just come into this thing already predisposed and you say it's always by accident, it can never be by an intentional cause, by a designer or a purpose, you're not going to make a very good crime scene investigator. I'm going to tell you right now. Criminal defense attorneys will love you, but, everyone else will hate you, and legitimately so. Okay, so you're an archaeologist. You come across a funny-shaped rock. Erosion, wind, water, accident, non-purpose or purpose. Was somebody trying to shape this rock, like as an arrowhead or some other use? Okay? You come across, let's say you're a cryptologist. You come across what looks like a random string of letters, numbers, characters. Is it really random, or is there a code here? You're an arson investigator. This fire, accident or intention. In every one of these disciplines, there are the hallmarks of design that they look for and they know how to look for, and that's science. Seminary professor, boy, these two papers look similar. Plagiarism or random, All right, that can happen, right? We know how to detect design in each of these cases. And I would suggest to you that the origins of the universe, the origins of life, the origins of human beings is in the family of historical sciences. We cannot say ahead of time that intelligence, purpose was not involved. We can't decide that philosophically ahead of time. In every historical type of science, we have to be open. And in that circumstance, methodological naturalism is inappropriate. And as even Richard Dawkins let the cat out of the bag in the movie Expelled, when he was interviewed by Ben Stein, he said, well, I suppose there could be some evidence that we were formed by an intelligent designer. But if it turns out that we were, it could be a Martian alien or what have you. But if it turns out that we were, that intelligent designer himself will have been formed by Darwinian methods. And I just love this. He tried to walk it back later, but he let the cat out of the bag. Intelligent design is valid as a scientific endeavor. You cannot enforce methodological naturalism in historical sciences. Okay? Now, is this a God of the Gaps strategy? Okay, I described the God of the Gaps. The idea here is, in our theory, we have a gap. We don't know how this effect was produced. We just assume God did it. And on this view, God plugs our ignorance. But then later, science finds the so-called true cause, and God's JD gets smaller and smaller. And God becomes superfluous, and it's kind of a bad apologetic strategy, they're saying. And we discredit ourselves. Now, this is the claim, and there are a lot of things that can be said. And I would say that theology has not always lost battles to science. For example, we believe that the universe had a beginning. In the 20th century, science has come to agree. But the fundamental problem is that it's kind of a question-begging way of thinking about this. We cannot assume ahead of time that all of our theoretical gaps are what I call epistemic gaps, gaps in our knowledge, that is, ignorance. And that none of them are what I call ontological gaps or gaps in reality. Well, that's big language. What do I mean by that? We see an effect in reality, and there are certain natural causal powers that are available, but they're insufficient to generate that effect. That's a gap in reality. Are any of our theoretical gaps like that? You can't decide ahead of time. You have to judge on a case-by-case basis. Let me illustrate this. Suppose that you are, let's say, a native on some island somewhere, and you see this, a volcanic eruption. And you might say, ooh, God is angry. And, probably if you had that experience, that would seem pretty rational. But let's say then you study things like geology, plate tectonics, volcanism, and everything, and you really can explain everything about what you witness from those facts. And maybe God is angry, maybe he's not, but the volcanic eruption is not enough to tell you that, okay? So that would be an example of an illegitimate God of the gaps kind of an explanation or argument, where we just rush to appeal to God to plug our ignorance about what's happening scientifically. Okay, that would be an example of an epistemic gap. But suppose instead of coming out and seeing the volcanic eruption, you came out, you'd lived in the jungle all your life, but let's say you understood English and everything, could speak, whatever. But you came out and you saw this. Oh, wow, look at that, okay? But let's say you saw this, the Petronas Twin Towers. You knew nothing about this thing. You've never seen a skyscraper in your life. You don't know the history about people building it or whatever. You just come out and you see this thing as it is. Now, here's the thing. Probably very quickly you'd make a design inference. But let's say you really wanted to be sure. So you look at this stuff. What is it made of? Oh, there's steel, there's concrete, there's glass, there's other stuff. What do I need to know to understand this? So you read physics, you read chemistry, you read civil engineering. You learn thoroughly the properties of concrete, steel, and glass. And what you will know is that there is nothing in the properties of these things that will cause it to be in this structure. This complex structure, which also matches an independently specifiable function. What we need this to be in order to function as a shopping space, F&B restaurants, for if you're very wealthy, or Mahati or whatever, apartments on the top floor. It matches these independently specifiable functions. It's highly complex. There's no law that is going to cause this structure to unfold imminently, that it's going to be in this configuration. It has to be imposed from without. What you will have discovered, my friend, is a gap in reality. This, as an effect, and the available natural causal powers inherent in steel and glass and concrete to be in this structure. You will have discovered a gap in reality based on a very thorough knowledge of the relevant things involved. This is not a gap in knowledge, and no further knowledge is going to overturn that design inference. Now the question is, are there any such things like that in reality? Okay. Well, I think we cannot rule in advance that all of our theoretic gaps are epistemic. We have to take them on a case-by-case basis, and especially when we're doing historical sciences, where an intelligent actor or a designer could be involved. And so this is the key question. In our next session, I will try to lead us in looking at a few things in nature that suggest design in the universe being the way that it is, and in living things being the way that they are.